Hi everyone, today I'm doing something a little bit different and talking about 26 things that I avoid when it comes to purchasing new board games. So some of these rules I'm pretty strict on and some of them I'm certainly a lot softer on. And I think even on all of these occasions, I have exceptions to the rules. So they certainly are not set in concrete. However, they do act as a useful guideline to me for me to kind of fight my way through the streams of games that come out every single year. So I can automatically dismiss some of them because I cannot simply play them all. I also thought this list would be useful because if you are not so familiar with my own personal tastes and you agree with a lot of these rules, then your tastes might align with my own. But before I get into these 26 things, I want to give a shout out to the show's sponsor, Keyender.co.uk, who are my go-to online retailer in the UK. They've got some great games at great prices and some pretty awesome loyalty schemes as well. So be sure to check out their great website. But without further ado, let's get on with the list. So I'm going to try and be as succinct as I can because I have 26 of these to go through and they're not in a particular order. So let's get started with the first thing. So the first thing I avoid is bloat when it comes to board games. So I really hate it when the new game comes out, maybe it's on crowdfunding, and then to buy it, you've got this module, you've got that module, you've got this expansion and that expansion, you've got this faction and that faction, and they all work in different ways. I've got no real desire to fight my way through that amount of content, not only because there's just too much to take on and I'm not going to dedicate that much time to it, but also of the physical space it takes on my shelves. So give me a self-contained product and I will be very happy. The next thing is escape rooms. I'm totally tired of this genre of games. I think they had their 5 minutes in the sun a few years ago. I enjoyed a few of the original ones, the original exit games and the unlock games. Some really cool creative ideas there, but I'm at a point now where my interest level is pretty much zero. The next thing is certain themes or settings. So this is certainly one of the softer rules on my list, but if your game has a space or sci-fi theme, it's going to have to be pretty special to grab my attention. And the same applies to vampires, zombies, Cthulhu, and even some intellectual properties such as Star Wars and Marvel. Again, my interest is very low, and again, you're going to have to be pretty remarkable to get me back on those ones. The next thing is an influential metagame. Now what I mean by that is a game where the interaction between the players and the relationship between the players trumps the physical game itself. And the reason I put this on the list is because me being the person who normally teaches games and buys games, I'm pretty much considered public enemy number one. People always gun for me, even if it's a suboptimal decision. Yeah, it's funny at times, but it can get a bit grating. So I tend to avoid those styles of games. The next thing is games that follow the cooperative pandemic system, i.e. games where you have a set amount of action points, you're working together, and then every now and then the game will do something to hit you back. And there are a string of these games out there. They all feel very similar to me, they feel generic, and I'm totally over them. So yeah, no interest in playing games like that. The next thing I avoid are real-time games. So there have been a few examples over the years where I've enjoyed real-time games. However, it does tend to be for a very short period before I lose interest in them. And I think a big part of that is because they are normally very frantic, they're high energy, they're quite stressful, and I tend to enjoy board games being a slower pace and to be more of a relaxing experience. So it's a bit of a juxtaposition there for me personally. And for very similar reasons, the next thing I avoid are dexterity games. The reason that I put this one on the list is because I tend to find that the novelty of these very quickly drops off. My interest wanes rapidly, and after a few plays, I've pretty much got no desire to play them anymore, and I'm ready to go on to the next thing. If I have that knowledge in my head where I'm probably going to lose interest in this quickly, no matter how fun it seems right now, then I'm probably going to avoid it to avoid that whole buying, playing, and selling, routine. The next thing I avoid is paper, rock, scissors style combat mechanisms. So what I mean by that is that you're, if you have a dudes on a map style game, you're coming in to fight each other and then you both play a card at the same time. You had no idea what the other person was going to play and they win or you win. For me, that kind of combat does not feel satisfying and there's no way of really predicting what's going on. The same applies to a lot of other games as well, where you have maybe like games where you're competing over cards or something, and to draft those cards you are using a paper rock scissors system. I think it gets way too the variables become way too much. That whole thing of I know that you know that I know that you know, for me it gets to a point where it's completely random. There's no strategy or no real tactical prowess that takes place there, so I tend to have little interest in playing them. Another thing I avoid are wildly asymmetrical games. Now the reason for this is because most people I play games with, especially in higher player count games, they don't really have the level of passion or desire to play games like I do, and a few of my closer real gamer friends do. So I don't really feel like the the initial rules offload warrants the gameplay experience, no matter how interestingly these different asymmetrical factors merge and synergize with each other. Now I'm not against factions having slightly different powers or something like that. That's easy to explain and don't divert too much off track. But when you're talking about each player having a completely different rule set, then for me that's a big no-no. It's just too much effort and too much front loading. I also avoid games that have player elimination, almost no matter how long or short these games are. I think it can offer a really horrible experience for some people if they've been picked on and they've been eliminated from the game early, and then they just have to sit back with their arms crossed watching everybody else have a good time, or even those players feeling awkward like they have to rush because the player's been eliminated and they want them to join in the fun as well. So I tend to avoid player elimination games for that very reason. I also avoid trick-taking games. Now, I will admit I'm not well versed in the trick-taking genre. There's very few games of them that I've played. However, when I have played them, I have very little connection to those rules. I'm not inspired or excited by it at all. And to be honest, it just does not resonate or click with me. There have been very slight exceptions to that, but I suppose you could even argue that those games were trick-taking. But yeah, generally speaking, trick-taking, not something that I look for. I've also got to a point where I avoid Polyominos style games. So this was another, very similar to escape style room games. There was a massive splurge of games where everything had Polyominos in them. And I'm at a point now where I'm so fatigued with them, I always go back to the old classic ones. I'm talking games like Patchwork. I'm just content with a simple Polyomino game, and not every single game needs to have some kind of Polyomino puzzle in them. So yeah, I think it's been done to death, and to be honest, I want something different. I also avoid miniatures games. So there's a number of reasons why I avoid them. Number one is that most miniatures games tend to have some kind of skirmish to them. I don't tend to like those style of games. There's some dudes on the map games that are exceptions to them, but I'm talking about real kind of deluxe, nice miniatures. I've got no desire to paint them. I just haven't got the time. And additionally, they take up far too much space. So yeah, miniatures, no for me. And I didn't even mention the cost of them. So yeah, certainly not interested in the vast amount of miniature games out there, and this is a really nice one to have on the list. There, I can look at a game that's coming out that costs a fortune. It's the hype, it's the buzz, but it's got miniatures. Nah, I'm not really interested. I also avoid games with multiple game modes. Now what I mean by this is that games that come with a competitive mode, then a co-op mode, then a one versus all mode. For me, there's something wrong there. It kind of raises a flag for me where I think there's something not right here. They haven't found the optimal way to play the game, the best way to play the game, and for me, I lose confidence when games do this. Now there are a few exceptions out there, but they are very few and far between, and I normally find them weak designs where things just haven't been play tested enough, and it seems like they've been almost thumbed in to give people options to try and appeal to a vaster market. I also tend to avoid games that have this back and forth style gameplay. Now what I mean by that is usually games with a tug of war system where I spend my efforts doing something where you spend your efforts to undo it. For me, it becomes a massive exercise of frustration. It doesn't feel like you're getting anything done, and I just do not find it enjoyable whatsoever. Now I understand this is quite a vague one without giving some examples, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying here. I also tend to avoid pure abstract games. Now this is a strange one because normally I actually tend to appreciate the pureness and elegance of a good abstract games. However, I almost get no enjoyment from them. So when I'm playing them, I can appreciate the design, but I just have no desire to play it and I want it to end. I always tend to feel like if you win a pure abstract style game, your opponent normally feels like crap because it feels like you kind of duped them, or they feel stupid, and the same applies if you lose as well. So I find them a bit too confrontational and I get a bit too competitive with them. So that's why I tend to avoid pure abstract games. Also, a big thing to avoid for me are memory games. Now, what I mean by that is not only the idea where memory is a pure mechanism, you need to remember what this was and that was to try and match them up or something like that. That is again, no interest to me. But also where you are learning a bunch of roles or things and you have to memorize how all the different characters work, what order they resolve in. Maybe some social deduction games or kind of hidden role style games rely on this style of gameplay. Too much front loading and you're expected to know too much too soon. And normally these kind of games fall flat on their face because you're expecting too much of the players in terms of memorizing what every single character does. I also try to avoid games that take over 2 hours in length. There are certainly exceptions to that rule in my collection, and however those games that do go beyond 120 minutes usually are pretty remarkable games and warrant that extra time. So generally speaking, these longer games are hard to get to the table for me. They're harder just to pull off the fly because they're normally more heavier and more complex style games. So, just my own personal lifestyle, they're just not a thing that I can regularly get to the table. So quicker games, this is just a matter of fact for me, quicker games and simpler games are easier to get tabled. So they have to be something special for me if they're going to run above 2 hours. Another big thing to avoid for me is when games have a heavy amount of text on cards. So for me, this always brings the game to a massive halt as people have a hand of cards, they're reading what all of them do. By the time you've read the last one, you forgot what the first one does. Too much of a burden, too cumbersome and too much to learn, too many exceptions. This card does this card does that. Just give me some simple symbology and give me a solid game to work with that symbology. I don't want this huge amount of rules where every single card is different and works in a different way. It just brings the game to a screeching halt. Therefore, I always avoid these styles of games. I also tend to avoid worker placement games on the lighter end of the scale. So I always feel like these games have so much shared DNA where they almost feel like copy and pastes of one another. I don't know how many worker placement games there are out there now. There's so much competition. It's a very saturated sector of the board gaming space. And to be honest, I do not see enough differentiation in them. Hence why most of my favourite worker placement games are on the heavier end of the scale, where you can add more things to them and make them different. Where if you want to keep it streamlined and simple, they're just normally rinse and repeats. The next thing I avoid is scenario-based game, and I've almost touched on this already on this video, but what I mean is that you have different game modes, there's no definitive way to play, and you are simply, when you play this mode, this rule changes and this rule changes, and when you play this mode, this rule changes and this rule changes. It just becomes a bit fiddly and confusing to me. I just like, again, an optimal way to play the game. So again, it just becomes a bit more work when I end up reaching back and pulling those kind of games off the shelf because I need to learn something every single time. So yeah, for that reason, I tend to enjoy games without scenarios and we just have a simple kind of vanilla way to play. Another big no-no for me is campaign and legacy style games. For me, these require far too much commitment, more than I'm ever willing to give an individual game. My style of gameplay, or the way I enjoy board games, is by dipping in and out of lots of different games. I like variety, and I'm not willing to spend so much time on a single game to get the most from it. So yeah, these just do not suit my lifestyle or just the way or what I enjoy. And on top of that, most of these games have some kind of narrative thread to them. I always find the writing extremely weak and generic and just not very interesting. So yeah, this is a really nice thing that I'm glad I don't enjoy, because otherwise I'd have a bunch of huge boxes in my collection that you're probably never going to play. I also pretty much instantly dismiss any kind of dueling or head-to-head style game. Now what I mean by this are normally card games where you're playing cards in order to reduce your opponent's health to zero, you're healing yourself up and smashing each other back. Those kind of games where you're just wailing on each other just don't really have any appeal to me whatsoever, much like the reason for those pure abstract style games. I never find them enjoyable when I win them, and I don't like being beat by them either. So it kind of just has a style of gameplay that just doesn't merge well with me. I'd rather have a more creative way of interacting with each other rather than just beating the snot out of each other. The next rule is pretty similar to the last one, and this is games with the take that mechanism. I absolutely despise it when in games you can play a card or do something that your opponent cannot foresee, and then instantly you're tearing down what they've spent ages to build, you're stealing cards from them that they have no way to stop. That kind of game never ever land well for me. Again, it's not fun to do it. It's not fun to have it done to you. Maybe those kind of games might work for your group, but they don't work well for mine. I personally don't enjoy it. So hence why Take That is probably one of the strongest things that I avoid when it comes to board gaming. And the final two rules are pretty much concrete for me. I will not play games if they have these features in them. The first of which is games that require some kind of deck construction, like LCGs, that kind of thing, living card games, where before playing the game you are building a deck of cards. For me, that is just far too much outside of the game. I've got no interest to min-max decks or overcome scenarios and things. It kind of ties hand in hand with that scenario rule as well. So yeah, this for me is just too much. I've got no interest in doing it. I'm not good at that kind of thing, and I'd rather also have a self-contained game where I have this hand of cards, do your best with that. Not take this card out, put this one in and spend hours doing that and tinkering things. Again, zero interest to do that. And also, these kind of games also demand a commitment to them in terms of constantly buying new material, new scenarios, new characters to keep the game feeling fresh. For me, again, I'm far past that. I used to dabble in this kind of thing, but not anymore. The last thing on this list is probably the most significant thing that will pretty much be an instant avoid for me, and that is roll to resolve. So I really despise it when some decision in the game comes down to you rolling a die, and if you roll a 5 or a 6, you succeed. If you roll a 1, 2, 3 or 4, you fail. For me, that is so anticlimactic. There's nothing creative about that. No, this is just such a deflating experience for me, and I do not enjoy it one single bit. And even some pretty involved and heavy, complex games still rely on roll to resolve. I understand why people do it, because it adds it's supposed to add some element of excitement to the game, some degree of randomness and luck to keep things unpredictable. But for me, I've never ever enjoyed roll to resolve. I just think it is just a really lazy mechanism now, and it does not work for my style of gameplay. So hence why I really despise roll to resolve. So there we have it. Those are the 26 things that I avoid when it comes to purchasing new board games. I'd love to hear what you actively avoid, because I think this is quite an interesting topic. And I've probably missed a whole load of these off my list, but these are the ones that certainly did spring to mind almost instantly. I think down the line I will make a list talking about the things that I actively look for, as a contrast to this one, and I think I'll also make a list talking about exceptions to these rules, because as I said, I want to stress these certainly are not set in concrete, and I'm always willing to have an open mind and to try anything at least once, but you just might not get my money in the first instance. But that's it really. I hope you've enjoyed this video, something a little bit different there. If you have, please hit like and subscribe to my channel and check out my other videos too. Also be sure to check out kienda.co.uk, and if you want to go the extra step, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/chairman of the board. Thank you as always. Bye bye.